It's too close to call it all. Exit poll defenders argue that these polls are being misused by the public and the media. They are not intended to predict the elections in progress, but to explain the vote after the election by providing information on what groups voted for which candidates. Networks are now relatively cautious in declaring winners without corroborating evidence from the actual vote returns. There were no mistakes in calling the states in the 2004 or 2008 presidential elections, but in 2008 the pollsters took the precaution of embargoing their results until 5 p.m. on election day in an effort to keep them out of the hands of people who didn't know how to interpret them. In 2020, the exit polls were complicated by the fact that so many people voted absentee for health reasons. Pseudopolls. A number of opinion studies are wrongly presented as polls. More deceptive than helpful, these pseudopolls range from potentially misleading entertainment to outright fraud. Examples of self-selection polls include viewer or listener call-in polls and internet polls. These polls tell you only the opinions of that portion of the media outlet's audience, self-selected in the first place by their choice of a particular outlet, who care enough to call in or click a mouse, self-selected in the second place by their willingness to expend effort. A second and increasingly common kind of pseudopoll is the push poll, which poses as a legitimate information-seeking effort but is really a shady campaign trick to change people's attitudes. Push polls present false or highly negative information, often in a hypothetical form, and ask respondents to react to it. The information, presented as if true or at least possible, can raise doubts about a candidate and even change a voter's opinion about them. Such polls are often conducted without any acknowledgement of who is sponsoring them, usually the opponents of the person being asked about, and at the last minute so that the candidate cannot rebut the charges being circulated. Legislation against push polling has been introduced in several state legislatures, and the practice has been condemned by the American Association of Political Consultants. There is a real question, however, about whether efforts to regulate push polls can survive a First Amendment test before the Supreme Court. Survey experiments. A final category of polls are those conducted by social scientists not so much to gauge and measure public opinion about elections or current events as to deepen our understanding of public attitudes, especially on controversial issues such as race, gender, and civil liberties, where respondents know what the socially acceptable answers to the survey questions are and so are less likely to disclose their true opinions. In survey experiments, the survey questions are manipulated in an effort to get respondents to disclose more information than they think they are disclosing. The number of survey experiments is increasing because the technology of the internet allows the use of images, sounds, and other multimedia in addition to the words used in a typical survey. When polls miss. For many issues, such as attitudes toward the environment or presidential approval, we have no objective measure against which to judge the accuracy of public opinion polls, and for most purposes, we don't need one. With elections, however, polls do make predictions, and we can tell by the vote count whether the polls are correct. The record of most polls, in general, is quite good. For example, almost all the major polls have predicted the winner of presidential elections correctly since 1980, except in the incredibly close 2000 and, partially, in the 2016 election. They are not correct to the percentage point, nor would we expect them to be, given the known levels of sampling error, pre-election momentum shifts, and the usual 15% of voters who claim to remain undecided up to the last minute. Polls taken closer to election day typically become more accurate as they catch more of the late deciders. Even in 2016, they had Clinton's popular victory margin within 1 point, although the results for several of the states were slightly off. Pollsters took seriously their failure to predict the 2016 election result and fixed what they thought was the problem, not getting enough white voters without college degrees in their samples, for 2020. They attempted to correct for this by weighting their results for education. But even with that fix, the 2020 polls still underreported Trump's support, and President Biden's margin of victory in the popular vote was about half of what the polls had suggested it might be. In the 2022 midterms, the polls missed in the other direction. The reputable national polls were pretty accurate, but the polling average, which contained a lot of polls conducted by partisan pollsters hired by Republican candidates or outlets, predicted a red wave of Republican congressional victories that never materialized. While the 2022 midterm discrepancy is not counted as a large polling error since the large reputable firms got it right, pollsters are still refining their methods to prevent the overestimation of the Democratic vote seen in 2016 and 2020. They have put a lot of energy into figuring out how to be sure their polls don't miss the Trump vote, weighting their results not only by education but experimenting with weighting by other factors, including rural/urban area, to try to find the missing Trump voters. Perhaps because of these, the polls in 2024 were far more accurate. The problem for pollsters that year, as in other recent cycles, is that when the election is that close, your polling can be perfect and a win by either candidate can still fall within the margin of error.